Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again to the MUTEK Recorder. My name is Claire L. Evans. I'm a writer and musician. I am calling you today from a kind of gloomy day in Los Angeles, California. But I'd like to acknowledge that today and every day, Los Angeles, California remains the unceded ancestral indigenous land of the Tonga and Chumash people. As you doubtless hopefully know by now, I will be here with you for the next half hour or so as your host, providing you with a kind of whirlwind recap of the forum's events today. But I am just the most visible and voluble tip of a much larger effort that is happening over on HOLO magazine. The team at HOLO is conducting a publishing experiment. They're seeing if it's possible to synthesize and document a conference like this in real time. You can determine whether or not that is successful. I think it's quite successful. Every day, my colleagues at HOLO are watching all of the panels and all the conversations and frantically collating all their key findings, references, links, images, and resources for you in a evolving, experimental, living document they are calling the MUTEK Recorder dossier. Every day, I am here to share with you some highlights of that dossier. But as I say every day, I encourage you to explore it on your own time because there's far more in this dossier than I could show you in this humble half hour. And I guarantee that no matter what you're interested in, you will find something that you missed and something that you'll want to explore further. Yesterday in this little recap stream, we were joined by the writer, coder, and artist Jiawei Wang, who shared with us a recipe for osmanthus tea, among other interesting musings. And every day we'll be joined by a different special guest who will share their interpretation of what recording means to them in their practice. If you're just joining us now for the first time, welcome. There's no time like the present, and we are happy to have you. Before we get to today's guest, I'm going to bop over to the dossier and show you some of my favorite takeaways from the forum today. Here we go. Presented to you today, by the way, in dark mode, just to showcase the versatility of the site design. We began with a really quite intimate and lovely conversation between the fashion designer Ying Gao and her colleague and friend, Joanna Brzezowska, talking about the poetics of interactive clothing, which is a wonderful idea. Shout out to my fellow Francophones in the building. It was lovely to see a conversation in French this morning. This Q&A really made me feel as though Q&As of this nature should always be conducted between two close friends because there was clearly a lot of love here and a lot of shared experiences. Really wide-ranging conversation. Gao and Brzezowska danced around a number of different issues and a number of different sort of elemental binaries. The difference between art and, for example, was something that was debated off the bat in this conversation. Brzezowska felt that the distinction between the two was fluid and experienced, if at all, in the body, while Gao was more eager to compartmentalize the art and design sides of her practice. And I think this seemed to be influenced by the fashion industry itself and its own sort of historic bifurcations between, on the one hand, sort of precious handmade world of haute couture, which can content itself sometimes to show a garment on a runway before locking it away forever. And on the other hand, the more disposable, mass-produced diffusions of pret-a-porter and retail fast fashion. Gao herself does not see herself as an haute couture designer in the kind of traditional sense, although I think that her work certainly speaks to the level of craft that is normally associated with haute couture as a practice. But her conceptual work also, I think, lands on this more rarefied haute couture end of the fashion spectrum, because her garments are not really meant to be worn, kind of like an haute couture gown, maybe made to be worn once on a runway or in an editorial context. Her garments are not meant to be really worn in the everyday. In fact, she took great pains during this discussion to articulate this kind of counterintuitive stance that the audience she envisions for her work, for her garments, are not its wearers, but rather the people who are watching them, beholding them, either through an image or through a film or through an exhibition in person. Her clothes, she says, are like soft sculptures. And as you can see in this image, I think that's fairly obvious that that's how they can be interpreted, as how they're read. When Gao thinks about the body, if at all, it is the body that is outside, looking in, and not the body that is wearing it. I found this very fascinating. I think it's there's an element of kind of post-human strangeness to Gao's work. I mean, not in the formal sense necessarily, but in this sense that there's a kind of fractured perspective between the wearer and the viewer. As Joanna said during the conversation, viewers can't touch, look at, or feel the sensations of Gao's designs. They can't inhabit them. So they have to sort of think about it in this slightly different way. And these garments also seem to have their own agency. They seem to breathe. They're reactive. This down here, for example, responds to the viewers themselves, how the viewers look at the garment responds to the human gaze. It's quite unexpected and beautiful, but somewhat alienating too, which is, I think, perhaps why during this conversation, Brzezowska made such pains to try to pinpoint biological inspirations in Gao's work, comparing her garments to octopi or to the fractured perspective of houseflies, to tropical birds and even artificial organisms. Gao refused those interpretations and seemed to draw more inspiration from atmospheric phenomena like clouds and reflections and mists, which also have a lifelike quality. Biologically dead maybe, but fluid, mutable, and volumetric. So the biological and the chemical, the living and the dead, the metaphoric and the literal, the inevitable and the accidental, all these kind of interesting dualities. And as much as Gao professed to sort of compartmentalize herself as an artist and designer, these are very ambiguous dualities, especially when expressed through clothing. And maybe that's because clothing is a permeable boundary between the body and the world, so it can exist in a state of perpetual negotiation. Gao ended this conversation by admitting that she's currently in a state of search, looking for a way to renew herself, a way to find a new voice for herself, a new form of practice, to do something that she's never done before, which I think is a pretty good segue to the next panel we watched closely today, which was about NFTs, the blockchain, and the changing dynamics of the music industry. Quite wide-ranging conversation about how crypto, in a relatively short time, considering, has made irrelevant many of the music industry's more stodgy institutions, and given artists the freedom to experiment in all kinds of new ways with distribution and value and their own fan communities. As in visual art, memes, photography, crypto has had a seismic effect on music and will continue to shake things up. One thing I really appreciated about this conversation today was the candor with which many of the panelists discussed kind of existing in a space between crypto culture and music culture, and the kinds of pushback they received as a consequence of releasing NFTs, especially during that peak moment of NFT hype in sort of February, March of this year. Matthew David of Leaving Records talked about losing sleep because he was so stressed about how people were perceiving his NFT projects. Jack Green, who did a very successful NFT project early in the year, selling publishing rights to some of his work, he observed that musicians seem to have experienced kind of the brunt of the fire and brimstone that was present on social media. My own band released a series of NFT stems in March, so I totally know of which they speak. I did not get much sleep that month either. In retrospect, I mean, this year has been weird in so many ways, but that moment really feels like a dream. It's hard to imagine a time before crypto being such a big part of the discourse with the distribution of art, music, and culture. Kind of feels like this moment of kind of collective hysteria, which was at the time compounded by this really tragic irony that here all of a sudden was an opportunity for artists to find new avenues for building themselves a sustainable livelihood after a year of unprecedented financial precarity. But then that thing that gave them that freedom was precisely the thing that seemed to enrage and scandalize substantial portions of their fan bases. So it felt like a particularly compounded kind of anxiety. But thankfully, the conversation has evolved, and the panel this morning was a really good manifestation of that evolution. We now are talking about more than just the ecological footprint of NFTs. We're talking about secondary markets and social tokens for fan communities and exciting new forms of collective ownership and governance. Foundation's Lindsay Howard, shout out to Lindsay Howard, one of the great curators in this space, pointed out that artists have pushed the space of crypto forward in significant ways just this year by pushing buttons, trying things, inciting conversations. And so we have to continue to do that to kind of claim space in this place and make sure that the landscape is the one that we want to see. and that we don't reaffirm the existing hierarchies of the art world or bring the music industry's more pernicious policies with us into the metaverse. Again, as Howard said, just because things are decentralized doesn't mean that they are automatically better. Who has a seat at the table, of course, is really important. Speaking of seats at the table, at my table today, my special guest today is the Swiss artist and designer Jürg Lehni, whose playful yet rigorous practice spans numerous disciplines in order to articulate the nuances of technology, tools, and the human condition. His work is lovely, often takes the form of platforms and scenarios for production, as with his really quite remarkable computer-assisted drawing machines. He's shown his work internationally, has lived and worked around the globe, and currently maintains a practice in Zurich. Welcome, Jürg. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Claire. Thank you.
Yeah, your work seems particularly suited to this conversation about recording that we've been having over the last couple weeks now on this stream. So I'm eager to see what you have to share with us today. Really quickly, folks, if you have questions for Jürg during this presentation, drop them in the chat. They'll be relayed to me, and we'll have time for a quick dialogue at the end. But for now, please, Jürg, the screen is yours.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Yeah, I'm gonna do what most people did and share my screen. So you won't see much of me during my lecture or my presentation. 1 second. There we go. Whoops. All right. So it's going to be a bit of a Finder tour, guided tour. I would like to start by explaining a few things about where I come from and how I work. So I often struggle describing my own position that is somewhere between art, design, and technology. My brother calls me a researching craftsman, which I think is actually a very accurate description. But I often use the metaphor of crop rotation to describe this kind of rotation between the different fields of engagement or of practice that I sort of need to in order to keep the fields fruitful, as in agriculture. So it all has to do with computer technology at the core, and I quite like this quite old illustration of computer technology from the 1940s to the 60s. This doesn't even talk about programming languages, it only talks about processor designs. But it really speaks of this kind of endless continuation of technological advance that always moves forward and always replaces old things with new things. Sometimes we forget what was there, but it's just constantly evolving, like culture or language. And this is very much how I like to treat computer technology, and how I like to think about it as something that's part of culture and not outside of it. I often like to show this image here, which I like. It very much stems from this time where people had to wait in line at the university to get their spot at the terminal for the mainframe computer that was filling a whole room. They could then feed in their program on punch cards and get the output on a plotter or a printer, not on a screen in the beginning. And usually it would be an error message, and they had to go back and punch new holes to fix the error. So it needed a lot of patience, and hence this gentleman's T-shirt, which tells us to be kind to our computer. Nowadays, we could interpret this message differently, but in a way, I kind of like it because I want to see computer technology as something that we should keep open and keep accessible and avoid consumer lock-in. So I kind of think this message still holds. One thing that's never changing is this kind of sense of disconnect when you work with computers. And I think after 1.5 years of pandemics and lockdowns, we kind of all know this feeling. So I think whenever I write software and I work through computers, I kind of have this sense of I'm interacting with the thing through a glove box, and I'm sort of removed, and I'm kind of trying to reduce this or make this kind of disconnect seem sort of approachable or almost human, and not something that's just in the way. So I started off, I mean, one thing I should explain maybe first is also that my practice is very much collaboration based. I started off working with a group of graphic designers in the late 90s in Lucerne, one of them my brother. This is while I was studying or starting to study electroengineering in Zurich. And they were doing this, they were running this artist-run space in Lucerne, which was maybe one of the first spaces for design like this in Switzerland, for 3 months. And they were doing a lot of events and things, and we were basically documenting all the activities there in a CD-ROM. This was sort of pre-internet. I mean, the internet existed, but you couldn't do these kind of things on it. So this was a very playful time of exploring sort of the creative potential of technology, and, you know, not super seriously, but really kind of like DIY, almost like digital punk, you could say, just sort of seeing what tumbles out when you shake it. We did a lot of, like, you know, typefaces, games, but it all was around this idea of, yeah, working creatively through technology. And there were a lot of events, lectures, parties, etc. And in the end, we documented all this. This was very much the start of my practice, in a way, where I noticed that this kind of use of technology was much more exciting than like serious engineering. So from there onwards, I kept kind of surfing this line between technology and design, and I kept working with this group of people, and we did a bunch of sort of almost like this parodies of design software, as you could say. Like, they're more like commentary on serious design software, or parodies. So like these two, they're two little applications that you could use. One was to make fonts with Lego bricks, and the other one with the Rubik's Cube. But of course, you could do other designs, and they were actually kind of serious in the sense that they were able to export vector graphics, and you could use them for design work. And then later on, we did this online multi-user playground that was sort of like an Illustrator for the masses. Multiple people would share one document and work together in real time over the 56K modem. This was in 2000. Kind of what Figma is now, but very early. Yeah, so this is kind of the beginning of all this. Here you see some output from this platform. It would record the image continuously, sort of like a movie. People would really kind of battle for the surface. You could, you know, work together or work against each other, delete things. There was no rules. It was very basic, democratic. And this is very much during the time where, you know, the internet was an extremely sort of experimental space. Nothing was really defined. It's a very exciting time to be working with software in this space. And then from there, I started going to design school. I changed direction. I went to École in Lausanne, and while studying there, I noticed that every student was sort of using software from Adobe Illustrator and sort of milking that aesthetic. And I started making work about that as a person who is able to program. I made this plugin called Scriptographer that allows you to write your own tools within Illustrator and extend the functionality of this otherwise closed system. The idea was very much to empower designers to build their own tools using computer technology as what it was originally intended to be, sort of a meta tool that could be anything you want it to be. I was using JavaScript. Everybody was laughing at me at the time. Nowadays, it's one of the most popular languages. And I was thinking that this would be the language that the designer would want to learn, because you could use it in the web as well. Here we see one example of a work that somebody did, Jonathan Puckey from Amsterdam, a graphic designer, who built this typeface that is not like a normal typeface. It's more like a, you know, a sign painter's kind of practice. You prepare a text, and then you click. Every time you click, it places a letter, and each letter has a behavior that you can change with the same mouse. You don't have to switch tools. It's very direct, very quick. And you kind of feel this sort of expressiveness that emerges from this custom-made tool. This tool doesn't need to be perfect. It can be quirky, it can be quick. It's like a prototype. And as a designer, you can toggle back and forth between building the tool and using it. And this was kind of like the idea that we had. Jonathan then became part of this project, and we started working together and also teaching together. Here is one of our workshops at École in Lausanne. And around 2008 to 11, we were running a research project there around the idea of teaching with Scriptographer. And one thing we noticed was that this ability to go back and forth between the sort of work environment and the code was actually very beneficial for the learning curve, because students could replicate in code something that they were already capable of doing by hand, or then they could inspect something that the code has made in the document again. So there was almost this tangibility, and this is what I was talking about with the glove box. So there's maybe a bit of less of a disconnect here. soft tangibility, I call this sometimes. Sadly, Scriptographer is not existing anymore. Adobe made it really hard to keep working on this. I was kind of dependent on them. So eventually we decided to build this outside, and we made a new version of the same principle. It's called Paper.js. It's a JavaScript library that runs in the browser. You can build tools there. I'm just quickly pointing it out. Or actually, I go quickly to the website. So the website, paper.js.org, has a lot of examples showing this in action. And what's exciting in a way is that stuff that was originally made for print suddenly starts to move, and you can bring these sort of sketches to life. Here are little sketches that Lab 212 made for an installation at the Barbican, I think in 2013, not quite sure anymore. So Cyril Diagne and his colleagues. And what I like about this is that it's very much like a sort of a 2D illustration come to life through code. And there's a quote by Zachary Lieberman about this library that I really like. He says, it feels like coding directly inside a vector graphics program such as Adobe Illustrator. And that's very much what we wanted it to feel. From this practice, I then branched out further. So kind of starting with this idea of making a commentary on the role of software in the design process, I started to also question the role of the hardware. And here you see a video of a bunch of the drawing machines that Claire mentioned in my introduction, or in our introduction. So these are different kinds of custom-made, mostly plotting devices, but they were all created with the aim to have an output device that is imperfect, that is almost human, that is struggling a bit with the task. There's friction, there's gravity, there's instability in the system. I was using these triangulation principles, and this was in a time, the first one was made in 2002, in a time where this principle wasn't really widely known, or nowadays it's almost like an exercise in making your own plotter. I believe we were, together with Uli Franke, who I engineered this with, we were kind of not the first, actually. I afterwards found out there were patents for this idea, as there always are. But we felt at the time we sort of invented this and maybe showed it to the world first. Doesn't really matter. I guess technology, as I said, always moves forward and ideas are sort of shared. But here, what was interesting in a way was that for us, we were building a printer, and when it came to life, we noticed it's so much more than that. There's a timeline, there's a choreography, people loved watching it. There's a gesture to this machine that was kind of interest, and so we started working with this. Maybe I could skip all this. So I think this is the interesting part. Here you see the software in Scriptographer that calculates the motion of this machine. And the machine is so unstable that it has to be moved on all these extra curves to make it move smoothly. So it's kind of treated like a ship or a car without brakes. And imagine you're holding a brush and you're trying to paint as you drive. That's kind of what it's doing. So when it's sprayed, it looks like this. And so, so in a way, there's this gestural quality to this. And I started collecting things together with a collaborator called Alex Rich. We started creating this archive called The Recent History of Writing and Drawing, where we were kind of interested in this other side to this design history that is not speaking in currents and styles so much, but more in like inventions and principles of manufacturing or mark making. So here we see skywriting, an airplane that flies in the sky and writes in calligraphy. So takes quite a skilled pilot. Here we see a chart showing how you bend neon tubing to make letter forms. And of course, there's a constraint in the material and in the process that then informs the aesthetic. And this is the GPS device attached to the man that draws the football field here, soccer field in the US. And there's this funny connection to how Hektor works. And again, like there's a gesture in this drawing that is never considered. And there's more. I think I'm probably using too much time, so I'm going to skip this. But Paul Klee has this quite interesting theory on this kind of idea of activated lines, lines in time, motion in drawings, etc. And what's interesting in a way directly links to today's idea of vector graphics, or here Donald Knuth's proposal of one of the first digital formats for type called metafont. So in a way, it's all kind of calligraphy, but it's also choreography. Excuse me. And this all connects for me. And it also became kind of like the content of the work itself. So when these machines started to make appearances in design and art exhibitions, there was always this question, like, what is the machine doing? Why does it exist? What does it talk about? And I started to think about the machine as in this case, Hektor, the spray paint machine, as sort of an entity that has its own kind of body of work. And I started to collaborate with different artists and designers often, and sort of questioning, why does this thing exist? What is it talking about? So we made a lot of different collaborations throughout the years. Here we see Hektor drawing a William Morris repeating pattern on the wall. This was a collaboration with Dexter Sinister in New York, where we were kind of more like revisiting the machine's own sort of handwriting or inherent sort of logic, a thing that it can do without having to do extra movements. These are Lisseschuh figures, mathematical harmonic patterns, kind of. Or here, when Hektor went to the MoMA in 2008, the drawing became about its own kind of motion diagrams or like movements, instead of it being just a service where it draws the title of the show, which was the original kind of brief. I then turned it around and made it about the machine, and I explained that it takes an elastic mind to be able to read this title. In the end, the title was also printed on the other wall, on the facing wall, so it became more the piece than the caption. With Viktor, things became a little bit different, where the use of chalk is almost the opposite of the use of spray. Spray sort of associated with street art and graffiti and maybe vandalism, but a certain kind of brutal directness. Chalk makes you think of the school room and being lectured or learning something. And that's exactly how it was first used. So here we see the show, A Recent History of Writing and Drawing, that I did together with Alex Rich at the ICA in London. And there we invited different people to engage with this machine and in a kind of a dialogue where they were lecturing about certain topics. Here we see Michael Marriott talking of the history of seating, of the last 5,000 years of inventions. And this very much talks of similar topics that I was mentioning earlier. Each of these chairs represents a specific moment in time, a specific material, a specific industrial process that was maybe appearing and triggered ideas in the designers' minds. And so there's this endless relationship between technology and the arts or the design world that we like to talk about in this exhibition. This is another drawing that was using Paul Barron's network diagram to talk about the problems of food distribution and industrialization in England through early industrialization there. So this became quite an interesting format. And then later on, I started taking it one step further, where the drawing became the lecture itself. And I call them nonverbal lectures. So here we see a sort of a collage of many of these topics that I just kind of mentioned. You see the skywriting there. You see a bunch of other things. There's a patent about the machine that predates Hektor, so it talks about the life of ideas as well. I can't go into detail now, but you see this, and the machine reproduces this. This was in China on a wall of like 8 times 10 meters, and this drawing was made. People could make their own stories as they were watching this, but there's very much kind of a choreography to it, the storytelling in the sort of way it is replayed over time. After this show, somebody sent me this sketch from the New Yorker, which I thought was quite sweet. It's actually kind of crazy how similar it is, like this freestanding wall. Even the scaffolding on the right is there and the door. And what's funny is, I mean, this says the math is right. It's just in poor taste. I think hopefully with my work, it's kind of the other way around. The math is never quite right, but I hope it's in acceptable taste. So lastly, if I'm not over time already, I want to talk about sort of the process of one drawing and how I got to the sort of final result. This is a drawing called Two Legacies that I did together with oh God, I'm drawing blank. That's crazy. That's it's 11:30 here, so Will Tobin, there we go. yeah, with Willem Tobin in LA in 2014, we made this drawing. So this talks about counterculture and cyberculture, and this was very much sort of the origins of that, and the origins of the internet and of the personal computer. And it's something that me as a person from Switzerland, I never quite knew, but I knew I was completely working with it, and it was completely informing my practice. So I wanted to research this, and the forum was kind of informed by Jeremy Deller's The History of the World, which was his mind map that he was creating to then create his performance piece called Acid Brass. When I researched this topic, I started drawing my own kind of mind maps, and I started noticing how they kept growing and kept getting more crazy, or more intertwinkled. Everything connects to everything else, which makes sense because the people from the military-industrial complex were also experimenting with LSD and hanging out with the counterculture folks, or sometimes they were the same people. So it was a very interesting time of very contradictory tendencies. And I started collecting these, and then I had to break it down into a sort of a graph that can be drawn. And I was using this software called Graph Commons, which you can build these force-directed graphs, and they help you find proximity in your data through just springs. It's quite nice. So here you see that kind of graph that we boiled it down to a smaller set, and then we put it into this system. And then once I had the layout, I could start drawing it manually. But then I also needed a sort of an aesthetic, and this is one of the first early tests, and I noticed immediately that this typeface doesn't work at all. So I went looking for a font. So in a way, everything sort of connects to in my work. So I started actually trying to create my own font for this machine. I found it in this book about architecture in Southern California, which is not quite the same place, but close enough at the same time, 60s. And it was full of these hand-drawn maps with this beautiful lettering, which I think is based or informed by stencil lettering, but it looks more freehand than that. So this person was probably really good at doing it without the stencil. Then I started tracing it in Illustrator, sort of, creating a more even appearance, a full alphabet. And then I even wrote my own software in Adobe Illustrator in Scriptographer to then turn this into a stroke font, because normal fonts, they're not stroke, they're outlined. You can't use them with these machines. You need the single middle line stroke. So I built my own tools for that. Actually meant to show this, but I don't know how much time I have. So this is Illustrator. It runs in a emulated environment because you can't run Scriptographer anymore on the newest Macs. But here we just see some simple Scriptographer tools. This one makes fractals out of drawings.
Jürg,
but more
Jürg,
yes, over time.
We love it. I'm being told in my earphones that we are very much out of and over time. And this is fascinating, and I wish we had hours to discuss it. Unfortunately, we will not have time to get into questions.
It's totally fine.
No, it's so great. Please.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly show the final result here. So yeah, okay. In the end, there's the font, there's the chart, here's the chalk version of it, and this is the interface running with Paper.js, running the machine. And here is me with Stuart Brand, who is also in the chart. And that's the end of my talk. I'm sorry for overtime.
No, there's such a rich body of work here. I mean, we could talk about it for hours. Unfortunately, we have to go. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, of course.
Thank you for everyone for watching. Tomorrow, the forum has all manner of fascinating conversations about AI, the blockchain, algorithmic censorship, and all kinds of things like that. My guest on the recorder will be the science fiction writer, Tim Mon. I'm excited for that conversation and all those to follow. Thank you for joining us again, and see you tomorrow.